Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Dane Clausen. I'm the Director of Publications Research and Professional Advancement of the National Communication Association's National Office. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to NCA's second 2025 public program titled Futures for Rhetoric and Democracy. Before we go any further, NCA would like to acknowledge the land the national office in Washington, D.C. resides on is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Notchtank and Piscataway peoples. NCA acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular, the erasure of both indigenous and African identities via slavery and via racist laws that segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Allow me to say a couple words about NCA public programs. Historically, NCA has produced two public programs per year, normally one in the spring and one in the fall. This year, for various reasons, they're both in the fall, one last month and then today's. NCA public programs are open to the general public and concern topics that are of great interest beyond the academy. Public programs are a way for communication scholars to share their knowledge and ideas with the general public in addition to fellow scholars.
Narrator window, close. Narrator window.
Or I think somebody needs to put themselves on mute. Today's public program was described in NCA announcements this way. Across the globe, in different national cultures and contexts, authoritarianism is on the rise. Prominent authoritarian movements and politicians have threatened the communicative basis of democracy, casting dissent and disagreement as disloyalty and treason. Connecting theory and practice, rhetorical scholarship must address the implications of authoritarianism on the status of democracy as a concept, model, principle, and context for rhetorical practice. Panelists will consider futures of rhetoric and democracy in an era of democratic uncertainty and threat. Panelists will address questions such as how do rhetoric and democracy operate in the world we live in now, whether at local, regional, national, or global levels, in governmental and non-governmental contexts, within and across diverse communities. How, if at all, may concepts and practices of rhetoric and democracy reduce violence and strife? What may rhetorical scholarship teach us about democracy? Our moderator today is Dr. Robert Asen. Rob is a professor of rhetoric, politics, and culture at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he holds an endowed professorship. He conducts research and teaches in the areas of public policy debate, public sphere studies, and rhetoric and critical theory, focusing on the ways that political, economic, and cultural inequalities interact with the relations of power to shape public discourse. Rob considers how powerful individuals and groups use discourse to maintain their privilege and how marginalized people seek to overcome exclusions to represent their needs, interests, and identities in the public sphere. Engaging relationships of rhetoric and democracy explores ideas and practices that may promote just, equal, and free democracies, as well as contemporary threats to democracy, such as white nationalism and authoritarianism. Next year, he will be guest editing an issue of the NCA journal, Communication and Democracy, on the futures of rhetoric and democracy, which led to today's public program and today's speakers. Rob is the author or co-editor of 8 books, the most recently being Rhetorical Economies of Whiteness, co-edited with Casey Ryan Kelly and published by Iowa State University Press in 2024. His first book, Counterpublics in the State, co-edited by Daniel C. Brower, was published in 2001 by State University of New York Press. In between, he has published books on rhetoric and welfare policy, social security, school choice, public life, and other topics. Rob has published or presented dozens of journal articles and national conference papers. He earned his PhD at Northwestern University in 1998. The format for today's 2-hour public program is that Dr. Asen will ask questions of panelists, and they will also have the opportunity to respond to each other's answers. We will have up to 30 minutes for audience question and answer time at the end, starting at about 3:30 Eastern time. Audience members should enter questions and comments into the Zoom chat, and I will read them aloud one at a time when we get to each one in turn, followed by Rob choosing a panelist or panelists to take the lead in responding to each one. We'll take as many questions as we have time for before 4 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to introduce our today's speakers.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that introduction. Thank you for noting my most recent and my first book. Folks can do the math on what that means. I want to note, as you did, that we have some participants here from a special issue of the journal Communication Democracy that will appear next year. And I note that Ryan Neville-Shepard, the editor of that journal, is with us today. So thanks, Ryan, for being here. And thanks for creating space in that journal for this really important topic. I'm going to introduce the panelists individually as we go through a series of opening statements, which everyone has prepared. But I'd like to just name folks right now. And I'm just going to do it in terms of how people appear in the boxes across my screen. So we have with us David Frank, Mark McPhail, Brooke Hoops, Jenny Rice, Rob Danish, Angel Maldonado, Joe Isagiri, and Annie Hill. And we're going to go in alphabetical order with the opening statements, and I'll offer some brief introductions. I want to reiterate what Dane said, and that all of us undoubtedly know that we are in a period of rising authoritarianism, and it's not just the United States, but across the globe in really different societies and cultures. And this really does present a fundamental set of challenges for us as communication scholars and rhetorical scholars. We think that vibrant deliberation is important. We value disagreement, and we think that we learn through encountering different perspectives. And yet, this communicative basis of democracy has been fundamentally flipped in our current moment and seen as something to be squashed. And sometimes that squashing happens quite literally through intimidation and violence. That authoritarians have chilled political cultures, have created climates of fear and paranoia in efforts to forestall open debate. They have constructed binaries of a supposedly unitary public against an other, typically a racial, ethnic, and/or religious other who suffers their direct ire. And this resurgence of authoritarianism and other forms of anti-democratic politics raises challenges for us, both in terms of our scholarship and our teaching, and also certainly the rhetorical practice that we see and participate in the world we live in. That authoritarianism transfers lively debate, disagreement, and protest from a public good to a public harm. On this basis, dissenters threaten the supposedly peaceful operation of authoritarian publics. Moreover, the discursive and material violence of these regimes propagates widespread harm and suffering for individuals and groups who are particularly targeted by authoritarian regimes. And we see that in so many ways today in our own society, in ways that direct people on an everyday level, like, for example, children who are afraid to go to school because armed forces are policing their cities and towns. Connecting theory and practice, rhetorical scholarship must address the implications of authoritarianism and its status on democracy in the various ways that we engage democracy, whether it's a theoretical concept, a model, a practice, orientation. And we know that for rhetorical scholars, especially both in classical and contemporary eras, democracy has both implicitly and explicitly served as a condition, an orientation, and an object for rhetoric. We like to think that democratic institutions and norms safeguard public engagement, and we also like to think that institutional actors operate with some sense of responsiveness to wider public discourses. Of course, we also know, and our scholarship has detailed this in many ways, that actual histories of democratic practice complicate this idealistic picture, as practices of exclusion and exploitation have accompanied democratic public engagement. And we also know well that the term democracy often has served as an ideological banner for unjust ends. Moreover, to invoke the term democracy is to connote its multiple meanings and forms. I've so far been talking about democracy and communication, but we might also emphasize institutions, laws, founding documents, voting, and other rights. And of course, as we have underscored the discursive basis of democracy, we might place this orientation into relation with some of these other ideas and practices. Our focus today is to discuss these issues, and we invite your questions. As I mentioned, we're going to start with some brief opening statements, and then, as Dane had pointed out, we'll have a moderated discussion and then question and answer. So our first panelist, and again, we're doing this in alphabetical order, is Rob Danish, who is a professor in the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo, Canada. He is the author, most recently, of Rhetorical Democracy, How Communication Shapes Political Culture, and he is the co-author of Beyond Civility, The Competing Obligations of Citizenship. Rob has long approached questions about the relationship between rhetoric and democracy from the American pragmatist tradition, and he has sought ways to imagine how rhetoric might revitalize democratic life. With that, I turn it over to Rob.
Thank you so much, Rob. So before I start, I just want to briefly say that I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this kind of event where open inquiry and the intellectual work to understand our moment happens freely. I think we should say that these events are both one of the great achievements of democratic societies and an example of the lifeblood of democracy at work, wherein we can practice together engaged inquiry, free from coercion. I think our moment makes clear that opportunities like this might, in fact, be in danger. I'm not sure about my other panelists, but I'm a little worried that the future might not provide these opportunities as easily as the past has. That's at least been on my mind lately. And also thanks to Rob for putting this together and for his continued work on questions about the connection between rhetoric and democracy, and to NCA for hosting or creating these kinds of spaces for these conversations. Again, I'm worried that all of this is precarious, or more precarious than it's ever been in my lifetime, at least. So I want to use my time to make kind of two brief connected points. First, in my recent book, Rhetorical Democracy, I argued that we ought to pay attention to what I'm calling rhetorical structures. And the idea of a rhetorical structure is supposed to, for me, get at the ontological grounds for the practice of citizenship. I'm interested in the ways in which the material circumstances of our existence create affordances or constraints or norms or physical possibilities for speech or for other communicative action. In my view, some rhetorical structures promote democracy, others inhibit democracy. And that includes our media systems, our laws, our physical infrastructure, all of which create possibilities for rhetorical practice, but the kinds of rhetorical practice that they create possibilities for are not always democratic. They could be authoritarian. So I think as rhetorical theorists, we need to pay as much attention to the ways in which we're positioned to participate in democracy as the kinds of communicative actions we use to do that participation. So for a very long time, I think rhetorical theorists pay attention to speech, public speaking, argument, debate, these kinds of things, which are extremely valuable. But we are positioned all the time by the structures that order us about, and whether we're positioned for enhancing democratic life or inhibiting it, I think really matters. So the second question is related to that, I think, or the second point I want to make is related to that. I think one of the great achievements of the 20th century has been the ways in which a greater number of people have been included in public discourse. I mean, the simplest example of this is suffrage, but there's many, many examples. I think that achievement has posed a rhetorical challenge for democracies. Obviously, ancient Athens is held up as this kind of exemplar of democratic life, but Athenians never faced the kind of challenge of expanding degrees of pluralism that we face. The practice of effective deliberation within deeply pluralistic citizenries is really hard and something other democracies haven't necessarily solved. In my view, we lack the rhetorical structures for managing that process of inclusion. We don't really take seriously how to include different voices in public discourse. We don't create the infrastructure for the possibility of inclusive deliberation. I take that to be one of the main entailments of someone like Robert Putnam's work. To practice inclusion or citizenship in large-scale democracies, I think what we need, and Putnam doesn't say this, is what I would call relational rhetorics of identification. As much as we need protest and counter speech and argument and agonistic debate, we also need relational rhetorics of identification. I think those practices create what John Dewey and Jade Addams called social democracy. And Dewey and Adams wrote at the beginning of the 20th century that democracy kind of existed both at the system level and at the social level, and that promise of equality in a law didn't guarantee material equality for people. Dewey and Adams felt we needed modes of association at the social level to promote equality and freedom, and not just systems of government. I think they were right. I think those modes of association need to be underpinned by relational rhetorics, and we need rhetorical structures that would promote those relational rhetorics. The last thing I'll say is that I think our new social media systems are widely incompatible with democracy because of the ways in which they structure or make possible kinds of arguments that are more authoritarian than relational. Walter Lippmann and John Dewey fought about mass media systems, about how appropriate they were as structures for promoting deliberation. Lippmann worried about how they distorted reality, and I think those were justified worries. We have different challenges with our social media systems. I think our media systems distort modes of relational rhetoric, and that is a deep problem for social democracy. We would need to update the Dewey-Lippmann debates in ways that could account for how social media as rhetorical structures create affordances for rhetorical relational rhetoric, or create affordances for things like hyperbole, division, this constitutive features of authoritarian rhetoric. I've started calling those cancellation rhetorics as opposed to relational rhetorics. So I think we're in a moment where our media system creates affordances for these cancellation rhetorics instead of relational rhetorics. And that poses a challenge for holding plural social democracy together. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing what my other panelists or my other colleagues have to say, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Before I introduce our next panelist, I neglected to mention three people who are part of our special issue but could not be here today, so I want to make sure that I name them. Mary Stuckey, who's at Penn State University and who's working with Brooke on one of the contributions to the special issue. Corinne Sugino, who's at Ohio State University, and Derek Handley, who's at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And actually, Derek, David, and Mark are working together on one of the contributions. So with that, let me introduce our next panelist, who happens to be David Frank. You can see I ordered those names, to segue because, I'm a teacher. So David is the faculty ambassador for academic scholarship and institutional partnerships for the University of Oxford Consortium on Human Rights. He is Professor Emeritus of Rhetoric and Political Communication at the University of Oregon, where he served as Academic Dean of the Robert D. Clark Honors College. He and Michelle Bolduc, and I apologize, Michelle, if I mispronounced that, recently published The Intellectual and Cultural Origins of Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht-Teicheka's New Rhetoric Project, which appeared in part through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His 2023 co-edited book, The Rhetoric of Judging Well, featured the opinions of Anthony Kennedy. Dr. Frank has dedicated his research program to the development of rhetorical reason as an alternative to violence. David.
Thank you, Robs, for setting up so well the problem that we're facing And I think tomorrow you'll see an answer in the expression in protests against the Trump administration, which promises to be the largest protest movement in the history of the country. I think we can also point to both the rhetoric surrounding the New Deal and the civil rights movement in the 20th century as successful efforts to contest autocracy and fascism. And so looking forward, what I'd like to do is identify two tools that my colleagues have developed that can help rhetorical scholars think through how we can respond to the present moment. The first is Derek Hanley's new book, Struggle for the City, Citizenship and Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement, published by Penn State Press. Now, it is available online, but I know that you'll resist the temptation and buy the book in bundles because it does offer a clear explanation of how Black rhetorical citizenship has been modestly successful in combating the urban renewal efforts in those three cities. And so Derek does a wonderful job in identifying how rhetoric deployed by Blacks to feature citizenship has been able to feature placemaking, community organizing, and critical memory to resist the bulldozing visions of urban renewal. The other effort, other than Black rhetorical citizenship, is the complicity theory offered by my colleague Mark McPhail, which I think is, if we develop it, could be one of the most important theoretical approaches in our field. And Mark, in his body of work going over 30 years, has demonstrated that rather than viewing rhetoric as neutral or merely persuasive, complicity theory argues that our communicative practices actively construct and maintain oppressive structures, making us complicit in their reproduction, even when we believe ourselves to be resisting them. The theory challenges us and citizens to recognize how language and rhetorical choices always implicate us in relations of power, demanding critical self-reflection about the ways our discourse participates in the systems we may claim to oppose. And so I urge my colleagues who are listening to this, who have a love for rhetorical theory and social movements, to see that Black rhetorical citizenship and complicity theory can help us to understand where we are and where we can go. We can also draw upon the successes of the New Deal rhetoric and the civil rights movement to see that tomorrow may be an answer to the problems that both Robs have so nicely articulated. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And I'm seeing and hearing the collaboration in your opening statements with you and your co-authors. Our next panelist is Annie Hill. Annie is an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. She is an affiliate in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the LGBTQ Studies program. Her research focuses on state, institutional, and interpersonal experiences of violence. Her first book, titled Trafficking Rhetoric, Race, Migration, and the Making of Modern-Day Slavery, argues that the United Kingdom's anti-trafficking agenda enacts violence and rights violations against migrants and minority citizens under the guise of stopping slavery. Her next book examines the Trump administration's hostile takeover of higher education, specifically by targeting academic freedom. Annie.
Hi, thank you all. I'm so excited to be here in your company. I just wanted to comment on the my introduction, which normally I wouldn't do. But Rob had mentioned my department, which is Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin, and then three different departments or centers or units that I'm affiliated with. And at this particular moment, 3 out of the 4 of those are in danger of disappearing. And so I think the Rob D is how I'll say that. Rob, who spoke before me, talked about really thinking about the local. And so it's impossible for me to present without thinking about what's happening in Texas, because we really are in many ways becoming the leader of the nation in shaping higher ed in the Trump administration's vision. And so I imagine a lot of you are somewhat aware of the compact that the Trump administration has offered initially to 9 universities, waiting for our questions to be sent in October, and then for us to make a decision in November. And then he suddenly extended it to all universities. But our regent said that they were very honored to receive the offer to join the compact. So the president of MIT, the University of Pennsylvania, so far have declined, and we're organizing here now to apply pressure. So hopefully UT does not sign on to the compact, but I will say it doesn't look good. And so I really cannot imagine what even the university, almost in scare quotes, will look like if this proceeds. So it's really hard to even imagine being able to do my job or possibly write the second book in these conditions. So in that context, I want to just say that I think the present moment in the United States, though not only here, is teaching us that many of our conceptual models are not fit for purpose. At their best, rhetorical approaches to democracy can enable people to generate and facilitate democratic practices, as well as to analyze democracy, its promises, its processes, and its shortcomings. However, we're at a historical juncture in which the very conditions of democracy's functioning are falling apart. Unable to withstand compounding pressures, internal and external, but not least of which is an anti-democratic head of state. So what I hope my contribution to the conversation will be to think about and to center the question of rhetoric's relation to democracy when one of the government's main targets is speech. And so I take Rob Danish's point about thinking about law, thinking about institutions, but what I think is really interesting is how much speech is centered as a target by this administration. If we've imagined and claimed that rhetoric and democracy have a productive relationship, how do we conceptualize moments, especially this one, when one seeks to destroy the other? And so part of what I want to think through is not only the kind of claims that we have around rhetoric and democracy being co-constitutive, but this idea, one, that democracy needs to function with certain communicative modes, and what it means if democracy is attacking speech such that it's not possible to communicate at all. And so one of the pieces that I co-authored with Lisa Flores recently is looking at what we're calling clandestine public address. And so that's really trying to theorize what sounds oxymoronic, clandestine public address, but the ways that people are now trying to communicate, in fact, using social media, in ways that are clandestine, in ways that will be ephemeral, in ways that will be underground, so that they can organize in ways that the state may or may not see, in ways that the state may or may not detect, so that they can preserve, survive, archive, secrete forms of communication and forms of democracy that can't actually be performed out in the open. And so these are one of the ways that I think we can potentially rethink our conceptual models for what does it look like when you can address a public. So do we have to think about the clandestine and the secret, of sanctuary, of stealth, as actually a rhetorical strategy for doing democracy in a time when the state refuses to protect speech, refuses to allow academic freedom, when it deports, when it detains, when it fires? I have to teach, I've said this to lots of people, I teach every class knowing that I'm probably being recorded. So what does that mean for not only this discipline of rhetoric, but for the doing of democracy in public? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. We are now all dealing with the potentials of that compact, as you mentioned, which is frightening. Um, so our next panelist is Brooke Hupes, who is a PhD student in communication arts and sciences at Penn State University. Brooke's dissertation examines the democratic relationship between the public and Supreme Court through the frame of judicial crises as they are mediated via traditional and alternative news coverage. And as I mentioned a couple moments ago, Brooke and Mary Stuckey are co-authoring a contribution for the special issue that's coming up next year. Brooke.
Thank you, Rob. So when we talk about democratic norms as safeguarding public engagement, what those safeguards looks like inevitably depends on what democratic institution we talk about. So for my brief comments right now, I actually won't be talking about the Supreme Court, but instead the institution of the presidency. And here I think my comments will at least dovetail with those of Dr. Hill's. So in literature on presidential address, there's often the assumption of the presidency as an essentially democratic institution. And with that, the expectation that when taking the office of the presidency, the president will advance the goals of a democratic nation. This assumption derives from a very liberal conception of democracy, that it's not just a set of institutions for transferring power, but those that take over power are meant to advance these liberal norms, such as the right to dissent and non-tyranny of the majority. That shapes how historically we've looked at presidential address. There's the assumption that major speeches like the inaugural address are meant to reunify the nation and address, in theory, all Americans, not just one supporting party. That was always just an ideal. It certainly was violated in practice and has inevitably been used for undemocratic ends, but those norms still functioned as a sort of restraint on the presidency. The expectation was that the office would at least appear to adhere to liberal norms of democracy. One of the problems that's come with the tilt towards authoritarianism, particularly in this democratic state, is that we're seeing a resurgence of a different set of norms that advance a very different notion of democracy, something that's less liberal democratic and more party competitive, institutions without the associated liberal norms of valuing of dissent and of minority opinions. The assumption instead is that you go to the full length of power and shut out opposition. One of the problems then that I want to raise that comes with studying presidential address in these times is adapting to these new norms. It's certainly easy to see Trump as an aberration violating liberal democratic norms, and that is certainly true. But it's unclear the extent to which Americans today, and particularly his supporting base, actually expect him to follow them. Instead, there seems to be an affirmative expectation to behave in a minimally democratic sense, to use institutions without democratic safeguards. So when we talk about norms safeguarding public engagement, one of the problems posed in today's political crisis is diagnosing and responding to the norms that the public actually seems to hold. If new, more tyrannical norms, unconstrained by the value of dissent, are circulating in the public, our assessment of what presidential address both can do and currently does is something that we have to adapt to as well, particularly when some of the public drivers of the presidency seem to be towards authoritarianism rather than away from it.
Thanks, Brooke. So our next panelist is Jose Joe Isagiri, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado Boulder. Joe specializes in public rhetorics, rhetorical histories, and the aesthetics of politics, exploring how decoloniality, race, and political power influence formulations of Latinx political identities in vernacular spaces and in institutional settings. His book, Becoming La Raza, Negotiating Race and the Chicano Movements, was published with the Pennsylvania State University Press, and it brings together many of these inquiries. Joe?
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for being here. The opportunity to reflect on the rise of authoritarianism with these brilliant scholars has compelled me to revisit how and in what forms I might have already encountered authoritarian impulses in my lines of research. And as will likely come as no surprise, much of my published work on racial projects, racializing discourses, and aesthetic politics has seemed to derive from a sensibility toward authoritarian-esque operations. My investment in interrogating racialization, whether at the grassroots level or at the institutional level, highlights, however dimly, the infra-constitutive quality of authoritarianism. And I borrow that term from my colleague, Dr. Omedio Ching. And those nearly uncontestable and heavily consequential attempts to misidentify communities along phenotypic and symbolic lines. Racial projects have been, in my mind, at least one of the many consequences of authoritarian impunity to label anything and everything according to a preferred image. And those activists challenging these racializing impositions have also been, in many ways, attempting to subvert this particular manifestation of authoritarian-esque rule. Authoritarian rule, after all, aims at limiting the agencies of some others, and racial projects, for the many ways in which they are consequential, are topoi through which agencies are apprehended and misapplied. But pushing this interest in the multiplicity of authoritarian forms even further, I've recently been revisiting a nearly forgotten authoritarian form, that of tyranny. I say forgotten only because of the relative lack of emphasis in communication and rhetorical studies, even as it has received more attention in other disciplines. And this interest stems from, in part, my own grappling with what appears to be the total freedom of the tyrant that ancient Greek texts attend to. The tyrant's capacity to operate without any grounding or apparent guiding from any source. Most of our other terms for authoritarian politics, in contrast, presume a grounding of some kind, flimsy in some cases, but nonetheless there to stabilize authoritarian productivity. Fascism, totalitarianism, and even demagoguery to a degree hinge on a secure substrate upon which to be put into force, collectivities that support or otherwise assent to the authoritarian. Tyranny, in contrast, appears to flourish within transitions to and from these more stable forms, or simply acts as its own apolitical form without caring to attend to any other. The tyrant's political moves are characterized by entropic movements between polar opposites, predictability and unpredictability, moderation and violence, freedom and imprisonment. Tyranny, which might certainly become more systematic, oftentimes betrays itself, since it would inevitably become something other than tyranny under circumstances that are more stable. So what of rhetoric and what of democracy? Taking the angle of the tyrannical in its emergence, democracy appears just as unpredictable and entropic, pushing away from a center of power just as forcefully as tyranny consolidates power toward a center one. But it's not that they operate in opposition to each other, at least according to Plato and Aristotle, who seem to acknowledge that similar impulses catapult tyrants to the front of the stage and energize democratic politics, resulting in a political maelstrom that's difficult to navigate. One of our panelists, Jose Angel Maldonado, recently affirmed this in his essay on January 6th, going so far as to assert that, quote, violence is at the core of democracy, end quote. Rhetoric, if it is an art distinguished by technique as opposed to atechnic activity, would appear to at once operate at contradictory purposes within these unstable waters. On the one hand, rhetoric stabilizes tyrants and democracies, granting a capacity to perpetuate each vis-a-vis persuasion instead of violence. On the other hand, rhetoric restricts their potentials, eroding them through a consideration of techniques, ethics, and knowledges of audiences, none of which tyrants care for, and all of which apply a pressure to the people to conform. Tyrants inevitably reject such constraints, but even as the people might embrace such predictability, these same techniques inhibit their capacities to rule. So within the chaos of authoritarian politics, rhetoric develops and destroys. And today's conversation, I hope, generates inquiries that will allow us to see which is preferable for our time. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And our next panelist, perhaps not so coincidentally, or maybe coincidentally, is Jose Angel Maldonado. Angel is an assistant professor of communication at the University of South Florida. He is the author of Falling to My Death, Vertical Rhetorics in Neoliberal Mexico, which will be out towards the end of this year in December from Clemson University Press. His most recent articles, Mexico Pésimo and Platono's Pharmacy, which is a fantastic title for an article, by the way, on hell. Both won outstanding article awards from respectively the NCA's Latina Communication Studies Division and the Critical and Cultural Studies Division. Angel.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rob Asen, for putting this together. So I'm going to use this opportunity that Professor Asen is granting me to develop and test an idea that the idea that discussions of cowardice can be and are rhetorical. Specifically, I want to discuss a shift from what I consider a rhetoric of accountability to a rhetoric of cowardice. So this is what let me sort of elaborate. More than 20 years ago, Slavoj Žižek warned about the ideological somersaults we make during violent times when we attempt to convince ourselves that democratic virtues can be suspended in the name of democracy itself. Thinking of democracy as the context of neoliberal economic order, he warns, and I'm quoting, coffee without caffeine, cream without fat, beer without alcohol are sold to us alongside the doctrine of warfare without casualties, as warfare without warfare, the art of expert administration as politics without politics, and tolerant liberal multiculturalism as an experience of the other deprived of its otherness, end quote. It seems something similar is happening within democratic culture today. Recent calls for leaderless leadership are themselves a feature of such ideological somersaults. So in this paper, what I will aim to expand by discussing democracy without accountability as a sort of conservative iteration of leaderless leadership. So in my book, I discussed in a section Aristotelian attitudes towards suicide as problematic because they conflate, on one hand, the desire to die, and on the other hand, the personal character of cowardice. Rather than debate whether suicide is cowardly, I want to focus on the rhetorical appeal to not be coward, to not accept cowardice. And it's an appeal that Aristotle makes that I think is flawed, but I think that it permeates a lot of our attitude as we move through life. So really the antonym or the unstated premise is that no one wants to be a coward. No one wants to be seen as a coward. And yet we see images of masked ICE agents violently attacking everyday people. And I can think of no other descriptor, right? Yeah, where was I? So I left a country that became militarized following the declaration of a war on drugs. And I've seen what happens when the military is used against its people. So more importantly, I've encountered agents whose hiding, right, whose masks allow them to operate as both criminal organization and military governmental regime. And that seems to be where we're entering now, right? It seems to be that the future has already happened to some of us. And so what do we do with that sort of understanding? That sort of revisiting kind of takes me back to this aphorism. Democracy isn't perfect. We've heard this. In theory, we know it, but perhaps it's time we rephrase it. Democracy is a practical endeavor. As such, democracy is always both under construction and under the threat of corruption. So the adding of facelessness among progressives and conservatives signals a deep desire toward separation and toward isolation. So the problem is not simply that those behind the masks can live a private life without consequences. The problem is that should they succeed, we, capital O, others, will be gone or isolated or annihilated or forgotten. So what can we do? In the book, I say we should value the lives of others the way that we value our own, which I know sounds really Christian and Catholic, but there's something there that I think we could take and maybe secularize in some way. But I think in this paper, what I want to do is to invite us to show our face wherever we dare to speak in the name of progress.
Thank you, Angel. It's striking to me, as you mentioned it, how during the height of the COVID pandemic, masks were seen as authoritarian, and now they are embraced by some of the people making that very same critique. All right, so our next panelist is Mark McPhail. Mark is the author of Zen and the Art of Rhetoric, an Inquiry into Coherence, the book Rhetoric, The Rhetoric of Racism Revisited, Reparations or Separation, and co-author of Birds of San Salvador, a photo essay of common birds. And as I was saying before we got started, I was pleased to learn, I know Mark's academic work, but I was pleased to learn about his photography interests and practice as well. His writing has appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, in Critical Studies in Mass, now Media Communication, the Howard Journal of Communications, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, Qualitative Inquiry, Rhetoric Review, Dark Horse Magazine, and American Literary Review. His photography has been exhibited in galleries in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and in various venues in Dallas, Texas. He's a recipient of the National Communication Association's Carl Wallace Memorial Award and the International and Intercultural Division's Outstanding Scholarship Award. Mark, you're muted.
All right.
Thank you.
Let me start. I'm going to follow the direction of my colleague David Frank and start by suggesting Derek Henley's book is a critical place to start in talking about the future of rhetoric and the future of democracy. And I'm just going to read part of what he's written. So I'm not going to speak for him. I'll put it in his own words. Democracy thrives on debate, difference, and pluralism, but it falters when political or social discourse is locked in rigid binaries. Science versus faith, diversity versus traditions, majority versus minority, blue state, city versus red state, city. These oppositions not only polarize communities, but also reproduce systems of domination by keeping groups locked in antagonism rather than fostering collective transformation. Academia has been targeted for reprisal and retribution, although racism and anti-Blackness exist within its walls, but has made inroads towards diversity, equality, and inclusive practices. Similarly, the targeting of NEH, NIH, NSF, and the Smithsonian echo the hostilities directed towards the NAACP, SCLC, and SNCC in the mid-20th century. These institutions work to make for a healthier nation in the literal and metaphorical sense. In other words, work towards making a more perfect union. But what is true then is true now and will continue to be true in that the future of democracy requires racial cohesion for it to succeed. For scholars to conceptualize for future rhetorical models for democracy, they should look historically toward the civic actions taken during the Black freedom struggle. To do so would mean that more models are created towards rhetoric's generative or inventive power and less of its critical analytical power in order to articulate multiple avenues for developing spaces for democracy, as well as moving beyond the language of oppositional politics. We should strive to create inclusive frameworks that affirm multiple voices and perspectives instead of framing activism as tearing down the other side. So I think that I was approached by Derek because in many ways, the work that he does is aligned with the work that I've done over the course of my career. And especially in terms of the importance of the Black freedom movement and in particular, 1964. Everything that we are witnessing right now in this country can be traced back to decisions that were made in 1964 by the Democratic Party and its decision to once again compromise the rights of Black people. Because the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was developed in many ways as an exemplar of successful democratic practice, when those folks went down to the convention, they were told, we'll give you 2 seats. And Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer famously responded, all of us didn't walk down here for no 2 seats. So that compromise continued a series of compromises that have begun since the beginning of the nation and led through more compromises, including the crime bill that Joe Biden and Bill Clinton put into place, and ultimately led to a significant departure of African Americans from the Democratic Party. At the same time in 1964, the foundations of the Southern strategy were laid out in ways that they had not been laid out before. The white Democrats from Mississippi began courting Northern liberal elitists, who then became Northern conservative elitists, and who now make up our Republican Party. So democracy, the future of democracy and the future of rhetoric, both will need to deal with the anomaly of race and racism. Because as Richard Rieke showed 50 years ago, despite all of the articulate and effective uses of rhetoric African Americans have offered, they have not been able to convince the majority of white people to relinquish rhetoric. And what Rieke asked then, and what I think I've been asking since, and I think we have to ask to consider the future of democracy and rhetoric is racism a rhetorical problem? And I don't believe it is. I believe it's a form of normative sociopathy.
Mhm. Thank you, Mark, and thanks
You're welcome.
for reminding us of those important connections and events across eras. Our next panelists, and then we're going to shift to some moderated discussion before we invite your questions, but please be thinking of them and feel free to start posing them if you'd like in the chat. So our next panelist is Jenny Rice. Jenny is a professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies at the University of Kentucky. Jenny's most recent book is Awful Archives, Conspiracy Theory, Rhetoric, and Acts of Evidence. And Jenny is the current editor for Rhetoric Society Quarterly. Her current research examines issues around white nationalism, and Jenny was gracious enough to come to Madison this past winter and talk about some of that, and far-right extremism. And some of this work will be featured in her forthcoming Quarterly Journal of Speech essay, It Will Change You, Proxy Parrhesia, Bad Feelings, and the Far Right's Brave Reader. Jenny.
Thanks. Okay, so one of the central questions of this forum is what strategies and appeals can promote the growth and development of rhetoric and democracy, which is a good question. But I fear that this question assumes a premise that we really can't take for granted in this moment, that the concept of democracy, however unevenly that term signifies, is broadly understood as an unquestionable good in public imaginaries. And then here I specifically join those who are sounding alarms about the metastasizing influence of accelerationism in public life. So figures like Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin, Elon Musk, have all openly embraced techno-accelerationism, which is aimed at hastening the collapse of existing institutions in order to bring about what they see as a freer future. A future that, as Peter Thiel puts it, quote, does not believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. Similarly, Curtis Yarvin, whom J.D. Vance once called his, quote, #1 political influence, describes democracy as, quote, a dangerous, malignant form of government. And he adds, if we can't eliminate the state, quote, at least it can be cured of democracy. Other techno-accelerationists like Nick Land, who a number of these figures have cite as their influence, Nick Land says that the, quote, the increasing exteriorization and speed up of decision logic make democratic deliberation a sacral remnant. So in other words, you know, for all of these figures and for the massive influence that they're having, what it looks like is that deliberation, democracy, and rhetorical engagement are just literally too slow. And here I really can't stress enough that these accelerationist ideologies are no longer fringe, though they may have once been, they are not anymore. And given this, it feels like asking about strategies that can promote the growth of rhetoric and democracy are not necessarily responsive to the idea that, as Yarvin puts it, quote, America is no longer suited to democracy. So given that fascism and speed are twin engines of this anti-democratic, anti-rhetorical machine, I think we also need to generate some additional questions, or maybe some additional questions about questions. Things like, what are the questions we should be asking about speed in relation to rhetorical democracy? And relatedly, if, as Hartmut Rosa argues, the desire for accelerated political actions from multiple fronts leads to fascist authoritarianism, what does that mean for rhetorical models of democracy? And then getting back to the premise that I started with earlier, what questions should we be asking if the premise of democracy as a value in itself is no longer widely assumed? And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Jenny. Those are definitely important questions. So I want to make sure we save time for your questions and answers. So, I have a list of potential questions I could ask. I won't ask them all. For the panelists, I think maybe the easiest way to kind of facilitate this part of the session is to use the raise your hand function if you want to respond to the question. And so the first one, I'm going to combine two questions. I promised everyone in an email prior to this that I would start with a particular question, and I'm going to sort of start with it, but focus it in a particular way. So we've talked about the future, about parts of the future, and by future I mean tomorrow and 5 years from now, right? From this moment on. We've talked about the future in ways that are both frightening and also, potentially looking for spaces of resistance and response. And so when we think about our role as scholars and teachers, what does the future hold for rhetoric and democracy? And specifically, and some of you have offered these already, so I want to invite you to expand on them if you'd like. What specifically should we be focusing on? What values, norms, and practices should we be attending to help us understand, to help us move forward? What should we be attending to in our roles as scholars and teachers? Okay, Mark, go ahead.
Empathy.
Say more.
Empathy. The questions that we ask are Aristotelian, maybe Newtonian. They're about bodies in conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm.
We're assuming what we're asking then is who's the problem? Who's at work? I mean, who's the cause of this effect? And that in and of itself traps us in an essentializing vision and an essentializing consciousness. The very system that we believe can practical reasoning, persuasion, and argumentation are the foundation of our democratic institutions. They don't work. And they don't work because we assume that somebody is that either the Democrats or the Republicans are the people causing the end result and the problem. And the question we should be asking is, how are we doing this together? And that means the first question you have to ask is, how am I implicated in this? Mm-hmm. That's what complicity theory is. How am I implicated? Right. And once you ask that question, argument goes away, and you are able to consider alternative ways of understanding these problems. I mean, this is as old as Plato. This is Plato, right? What's justice? Justice is the interest of the stronger. Right. Thrasymachus of Chalcedon. Right. Never said it.
Right. And maybe this is a question, a follow-up question, and others, please offer your ideas or extend on something that you introduced in your opening statement. So maybe this is a problem of pedagogy. But how do we get people to make themselves open to, interested in empathy? Because it seems like we're living in a time where a lot of folks at least have zero interest.
Well, the only thing you can do is live it yourself. But that points to that's the fact that you asked the question. It's a nonsensical question. You don't educate people into empathy. You can educate them out of empathy, and we do a very good job at that. In fact, I think our educational institutions have done an exceptional job of educating people out of empathy, right?
Mhm.
Education is educare. We assume it's to lead out of ignorance. I think the outcomes that we see indicate that we have been led out of empathy. So all you can do is live it. So the best example of this, I would say, would be Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think the speech that most embodies this is the drum major address. Because what he says is, our impulse is to be the first, to be the best. And everybody loves that. And this is actually referencing an earlier text. And then what he points out is, well, that leads us to all these behaviors. So we want to be the first, so we got to keep up with the Joneses, so we might start making bad decisions. So he points how we're implicated in this larger system, right? And then he leads right up to racism. And when he gets there, everybody, it's perfect. It makes perfect sense. If you want to be the best and the first so badly, you may end up doing what a racist does. And so when he says, I want to be a drum major, what he's doing, he's totally transforming the notion of dominance as it's understood in Western culture. And the irony is that phrase was on his memorial, and it was removed because people said it made him sound conceited. Anyone who had ever read that address would know that that was a complete misinterpretation of that address. So
Yeah.
look to the African American rhetorical tradition. You'll find your answers there.
Thank you, Mark. Brooke, what should we be focusing on right now?
So I'm coming from a slightly different perspective, that I'm thinking about the 2024 election and the repeated phrase of democracy's on the ballot. And I think there were two problems with that phrase. One being, a lot of Americans at the time didn't care about democracy, they cared about the economy. But beyond that, when asked to elaborate, well, what do you mean by democracy being on the ballot? A lot of people didn't have a clear way to answer that, particularly when a lot of the arguments we've used historically to defend democracy need to be adapted to an age where many Americans feel either apathetic or powerless. I know one of the questions that came up in the comments was, well, what about money in politics? And so whenever we're in a case where it feels like voting doesn't matter and that everything is predetermined by the vast influence capitalism has on our election systems, part of what it means to approach rhetoric in the future is, how do we teach students to be better versed in arguments about and in support of democracy in the very imperfect context in which we currently live? That we should have an answer to what it means for democracy to be on the ballot.
Right. So let me ask you a follow-up question, Brooke. So is there a particular way that we as rhetorical scholars, or are there ways that we as rhetorical scholars understand democracy that could sort of respond to that question, and maybe even make sort of public understandings of democracy seem more engaging, more sort of enticing, more, hearty?
I mean, I don't want this to sound like pandering to specifically you, Rob, but I very much am compelled by the idea that you get from Dewey of democracy as an everyday way of life. That I think when we think about what politics looks like in our current life, most of us have a very negative association with it. One of the hopefully unsuccessful strategies that has come for undermining the protest tomorrow is calling it a hate America rally. There are many things to be very upset about in America right now. But I think something that rhetoric could offer that would be very important today is giving students a language to talk about what it means to value democracy and your association with people that you actually know, with democracy at the local level, with democracy at the intimate level, in a way that is not only a recognition of the very systemic problems that we need to deal with, but why democracy is worth valuing and embracing in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. Annie, what should we be focusing on?
I think I want to refer to your idea of educators. I think one of the things, I think we really have to kind of question what exactly we're doing. Like, this is a great moment to really, what are we doing and what our role is. I have, since I was a grad student and entered the discipline of rhetoric, always kind of chafed at any kind of discussion of what we were doing was training students to be citizens. Always assuming that we had citizens of what nation in our classroom, all of the assumptions that didn't allow us to explore. And so one of the things that I think even kind of, I think we really have to get into first principles of even what is actually existing democracy. And I think we have to think of education as multi-directional. I don't really think I have any business being in a classroom telling students what democracy is, but I think I could be in a classroom talking with students about how we're experiencing what is named democracy. And one of the things that I think would really help in this moment is to be really honest and real with students about what's happening. Like I said earlier, when I said I teach and I'm aware that I'm being recorded, that's not something that I'm like holding in my head and I'm afraid. That's something I say in the classroom. And we're going to do this anyway. And that shifts everything because they're thinking it too. Either they're thinking it because maybe this is something they're going to do, or maybe that's what the word. This is what's happening. They're not unaware of it, and that means that we're not going to pretend that we're doing something. We're not going to pretend that we're going to have these conversations. We're actually going to have these conversations, and the stakes are real to them. And so I think as educators, it might actually mean that we have to kind of change our position, which means really talking about and demonstrating to them how implicated we are in reproducing different patterns of dominance in what we do, and also trying to show them how we are also trying to create other kinds of systems, other kinds of education, and also, you know, mentioning that the fact that we're in the room always already means that we're engaging in a process that is not inclusive. If you're at a university, full stop. So that's what I would say. I guess the short version of that is just be real.
Yeah. And how do the stakes look different if you like take this perspective, and especially if you kind of start where students are at and their sense of where we're at?
They trust you.
Okay.
In my experience, they trust you because you're not teaching from a distance. And it's okay to show them that you're scared, that this is unprecedented and I don't know, but these are the skills that I have. This is what I've experienced before, and this is the best that I've got. And this is what I also feel like at this historical moment, I'm 48. So I'm like, this is what I can show you, because what I know, some of it is disappearing, and you understand stuff that I can't understand about social media, about the way you communicate, all of those things. So to me, this is the multi-directionality of we need each other to understand what once was and how we communicated and how we learn and what is coming. And so for me, this becomes, I don't know, the metaphor I have is just that it is not the kind of idea of the pedagogue as the person with knowledge who's transmuting it. I think we need, Mark kind of said empathy. I really think this is a moment of humility. I think we have a lot of smart people in the room, a lot of great ideas. We have a great discipline, but we really have to be learning and listening from our students right now and saying, like, this is what I've got. And it's absolutely not enough, but I think they have to trust us, because I think they're right not to trust authority right now. And so this is, for me, like, we really have to rethink the way we enter a classroom, what education is, and what it means to even talk about democracy. And to get real about that, and to start at the basic premise of what is actually existing democracy as we know it. And that is an open question to me.
Right. Definitely.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find the raise your hand button. I apologize for
no worries. This works too.
I'm coming from a similar place as what you're saying, Annie. teach at a public university in Florida, and Texas, I imagine, is experiencing a lot of the same things. In Florida, our students have the right, the written legal right to record our lectures. They don't have the right to record discussions. They don't have the right to record fellow students, but they can discuss our lectures. And originally it was for the purpose of their study, but it became for the purpose of if they wanted to take what we said to a different sort of legal sphere or something like this. And that terrifies a lot of my colleagues, right? All of a sudden, everybody says that they do the things in the classroom that you never heard them say that they did before, right? And some do and some don't. And because ultimately it's scary to know that you could say something that you don't mean to say and somebody could take it out of context and lo and behold, you're fired, right? Or something along those lines. But I feel like the rhetoricians come from in the Western tradition, we come from, that is kind of our history, right? If we trace our, and I know I'm a person of color, I'm indigenous, I know that I'm doing some essentialisms here, but if we trace ourselves to like that Western civilization definition of rhetoric, like the emergence is democracy. The emergence is teaching people to be subversive, teaching people how to use democracy, how to live in democracy, but also how democracy is going to function against you, right? How democracy is a system that can help you, but also injure you. And so I agree with so much of what you're saying, Annie. It resonates with so many of my experiences, which are, to me, as I'm hearing what you guys are saying, I thought of two things: one, commitment, and the other one, accountability, right? So commitment to showing up to your classroom and doing the things that you normally do, and accountability to the things that you say and to the things you're really to the people who you're there for, right? And ultimately, I'm there for my students because I know that my students aren't the ones, they don't see me as an enemy, and I don't think that all of them are necessarily coming at this place to like find the liberal professor and get them fired or something like this. In fact, I think so many students want to learn from us. And yeah, it's scary it is scary to live in an environment like this, right? But what else are we supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Angel. Jenny?
So one thing I'll kind of say here is, as I'm thinking about students, students in my own classroom, I also have a kid who just started college, so she's a freshman. And one thing that I think is really important to look at is that in their immediate context, in a very real way, they're facing, because of, again, the speed of AI, a good majority of them are facing the reality that what they thought their future was going to look like in 4 years is going to be very different. So they're concerned about jobs. So my daughter, declared a major and then immediately was like, I don't even know if this job will exist in 4 years. And more of them are, facing this. And I think that it not only just shapes their idea of, what am I going to do for a job once I leave college, but it also shapes this idea of what does agency look like? What does collectivity look like? Which then I think trickles down in some sense to democracy. And I don't think that it is necessarily an unfounded concern that they have. And so in some ways, when I'm thinking about, how do we talk with students, or how do we talk with, like younger generations about sort of these, what democracy looks like, these ideas, I think it's important to kind of meet them where they are in terms of life is going to look very, very different in terms of, again, collectivity. And that is stark and it's really bleak for a lot of students, just personally, thinking like, hey, maybe, this job that I might want, or they may be actually, witnessing, people's careers phased out, people who have just graduated. And I'm saying that because I think that in some sense, it's not that democracy is unimportant at all. In fact, but I do think that their faith in that as an idea, even an idea to be developed, is, I think, being shaped by this this larger force, that they realize their life is going to look far different than it's looked for previous generations before. And so repeating sort of the models of democracy that we have had and trying to, sort of recreate those models, to me, feels like it's going to it misses the reality, but it also misses where they are at. Again, this feels bleak, and I don't want it to sound bleak, but I think it's really important to just be realistic about that. That's where I'm kind of coming from anyway.
Yeah, thanks, David.
To answer your question directly, I would urge people to read or reread Chomsky's 1967 article on the responsibilities of a public intellectual. And he says that we need to be able to confront power and speak truth to power and to be morally courageous. And when Joe and Angel were talking about cowardice, it is embedded in the university system. And it's astonishing to me just to see so many full professors, white males in positions of great power, remain silent. And it's a great tragedy that our wonderful university system at Columbia and Harvard and other places are capitulating under the pressures of the Trump administration. And so if we reread or read for the first time Chomsky's declarations, we would see that we do have power, and that the power of tenure and the power of being a professor, they're both wonderful, and that we need to be able to translate what we know and what we theorize for people who are not academics. And the first step is what Mark has suggested, empathy, trying to understand how people are feeling in their contexts and situations.
Yeah. So, how should we think about the role of rhetoric, and perhaps for people who are joined us today, communication, other areas of communication, in this sort of broader picture? So, as communication scholars, that naturally is our focus, and as a number of the panelists have suggested, we tend to think about specifically the role of communication, and those of us who are rhetorical scholars, in democracy, both its practice and challenges, contemporary challenges. And so, what about other things like institutions, law, rights, other things that we might be inclined to associate with democracy? And let me give you an example. So, Brooke mentioned this. I'm, a Deweyan in various kinds of ways. Two Robs, two Deweyans. There you are. And so I've spent a lot of my career arguing that we too quickly associate democracy with institutions. Like, democracy means the vote. And obviously the vote is powerful and important. But I've argued that we need to think about relationships and the ways in which people interact. And I still believe that. I still believe that to be the case. And I also think that maybe I have underappreciated the role of institutions. And we see what happens when institutions are attacked, and the wider effects that has, and how that point of entry into this larger question can shape discourse, can shape law, can shape a whole host of other things. So as you think about, to the panelists, as you think about your work as a rhetorical scholar and as a communication scholar, how do you place your specific interest in communication in relation to some of these other things like law, institution, rights, etc.? Police forces, we've talked about ICE, right? So militarized kind of forces of policing. Where does rhetoric fit in all this?
I can kind of take a stab at that if you'd like. It's
Sure.
okay. And so the Mexican Constitution defines democracy as something that people have to do in their everyday lives, as that. They define, let me see if I remember, public education is a feature of democracy according to the Constitution. So it's a very different constitution in that sense, in that it kind of places the citizen at the center of, it's almost a cultural definition of democracy. Now, how that functions is completely different, right? Because it's also a country where you see a lot of, historically we've seen a lot of corruption, right? And then these In these last two administrations, it's been interesting because some of what I heard Brooke talk about was what do people most immediately care about, right? And in the last election, it was the economy. And the last two administrations in Mexico, the presidents have won because they have focused on improving the conditions of the middle class over the militarization of Mexico. And basically, they have identified that people care more about living an economically better, not poor, right, but better life than they care about the violence. It's almost like they've normalized violent conditions. And this is for the benefit of the state, to be clear, not for the benefit of the people, right? The governors have, the last president left the presidency with a positive approval rating. The current president finished her first year with a positive approval rating. It is a really different and interesting moment in Mexico where voter turnout has been pretty high, where people feel that they're participating in the culture. And at the same time, they're not moved by some of the concerns that we are now experiencing in the United States. And so there's something that I'm trying to tease out about what happens if we take some lessons that we tend to ignore from Latin American countries because we see ourselves as being different from Latin America, right? And yet, the more I look there, the more I think that that there's something that we have to learn. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just note Annie's comment in the chat that in teaching rhetoric and the law, I'm quoting now, I teach the Declaration of Independence and, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house together. It moves students in so many ways. Annie, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that. Don't feel like you have to, but.
Yeah, we have the anybody who's keeping up on University of Texas, we have the Civitas center here, just got $100 million. We have gutted our core curriculum, so got rid of all the flags. This is a way to consolidate all of the ethnic studies departments, got rid of writing studies flags. And so we now have a civics curriculum that they're rolling out where people are encouraged to study Western civilization and democracy. And so this is kind of the way that they are restructuring the curriculum. And so in the Rhetoric and the Law, I've always taught the Declaration of Independence. So these are going to be the kinds of documents that they are going to want us to teach only. But I've always taught that document with Audre Lorde's speech. And I think that's really important for students to have these kinds of like vaunted documents next to stuff that they've never been exposed to and have them presented at the same kind of level so that they can see what was the rhetorical situation where you had this hostile audience and you had to address King George III or you had to address white feminists in a New York University conference. And what was the task there? And how do you actually, when you have a hostile audience, how do you actually walk into that room? Or is this a performative speech act or an act of treason? And those kinds of moments. So we stop teaching in ways that kind of lead with what are the quote unquote foundational documents. And then we kind of punchline other documents, people of colors movement, civil rights movement, women movement, gay movement, that kind of anti-intersectional organization of our syllabi that I actually think teaches them a misguided view of history, but that also really helps the administrations who want to cut off the kind of last hired, first fired, these area studies departments that don't look like they're part of the traditional core. And so I think that is going to happen. And so quote unquote, integrating your syllabi is one way to actually preserve and archive some of these texts and subjects that are going to disappear from being institutionalized or departmentalized in different universities.
Right. Thanks, Annie. Jenny, what's the role of rhetoric in all this?
Well, so I'm what Annie's saying makes me think about so for the last 10 years or so, I've taught our legal writing course for our pre-law students here, which is great. So we're I'm in those classes able to sort of talk through these things, but I feel like this is a very, there's a moment, there's an opening right now, an exigence after the Charlie Kirk situation and what's happening on campus. I think I'm seeing just widespread in public life, people are talking about First Amendment, talking about speech, talking about deliberation, and in some ways, we're seeing a very bleak reframing of sort of Charlie Kirk as a model of deliberation, sort of in public discourse. But people are talking about speech, public speech for these things in a way that, is not usually sort of something that people are talking about. And I think for me, this moment is an opening. It's a moment of Kairos. It's an opportunity to sort of like step in and have those conversations, because students don't often talk about free speech, but on certain campuses, they're seeing their own speech being, certain students being kicked out, and those kinds of things. And I think it's important when we have, because of just the general chaos of our political life right now, I think we'll find these openings. And when we do, it's important to step into those moments. And I think this is definitely one. It may not stay open necessarily, but right now it is. And I think sort of becoming more attuned to when those moments open up and say, hey, this is a chance for us to talk about, like, I'm able to talk about things like viewpoint discrimination regarding First Amendment, which is a very specific kind of legal concept that now takes on this reality for people where maybe it hasn't before. So, thinking about institutions and sort of getting people to think about institutions and democracy can be very difficult unless there's, for some reason, this opening. So that's all I'll kind of throw out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. Brooke?
I think jumping off of what Dr. Rice said, there's an analogous situation happening that is still frustrating to me, that it seems like a lot of the American public found out what democratic institutions were doing after it became determined that those institutions were being gutted or taken away, that particularly with the Doge firings, the first time many Americans heard about departments was in the context of them being eroded. On the one hand, that is deeply frustrating because that suggests a breakdown in our information systems that we didn't know what, for example, USAID or the Department of Education did. At the same time, comparably with the events that happened with Charlie Kirk, I think it suggests a kind of opening for these conversations, and the way that they happen matter. What was democratic deliberation supposed to look like? What does it mean for debate to be done in the right way? Or why decades ago were things like the Administrative Procedure Act passed in requiring notice and comment periods, that the public was supposed to be able to participate in agency rulemaking for agencies they didn't know existed until those agencies went away. That as frustrating as these moments of democratic decline are, the benefit of them is they're making visible ways democracy worked in the background and could work better if we get the opportunity to repair them.
Right. Yeah. All right. So we're going to switch now to your questions and comments. There are some in the chat already. I encourage you, if you have not yet put something in chat and you would like to please do so. And I'm going to turn it over to Dane, who's going to read some of the questions. And then for the panelists, I think same thing. If you would like to respond to one of the questions, please let us know. Dane, go ahead.
Thank you, Rob. Dr. Oscar Maya, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, maybe not, sorry, quotes a statement from the White House that says, quote, common threads animating this violent conduct include anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. They're unquote. There's not a question here, but I think it's quite provocative material to respond to.
I'll start us off. I will note the perhaps tension, maybe even contradiction in the portion that you have quoted, Oscar, that there's a concern about hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. And there is a censoring of views that the administration considers to be anti-American, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity. As an anecdote, 4 or 5 years ago, I gave a lecture at the Autonomous University of Madrid, and they name the streets on campus after great thinkers, and one of the streets was named after Marx. And I thought, there never, ever, ever will any American college or university name a street after Marx. And so it's the idea of tolerating, or as you put it, Jenny, viewpoint diversity, kind of reveals much about the moment that we live in terms of which viewpoints are to be expressed and appreciated in their diversity, and others that are to be censored and shut out and removed from the classroom. But anyway, I've talked too much about it. Do others want to respond to the quote that Oscar has shared? It's towards the top of the chat, if you're wondering, because the chat is starting to grow now. It's like 4 or 5 comments down. Oscar, let me invite you. Would you like to say more about the quote that you've shared?
At the time when everyone was talking, hi everyone. At the time when everybody was talking, I think it's this idea of what violence is, what constitutes violence, where violence comes from. And if we're thinking about public debates and what is in the public and who is responsible for holding our students kind of captive to certain ideas, even questioning anything, or even like debating what these ideas are in terms of our democracy or subjectivity or nationality or whatever it is, gender, race, whatever, indigeneity, then we're invited into kind of into this space. And so anybody, then everybody that's like being recorded, right? Or like, I feel like even bringing up this thing in class and like putting it up on the board and talking about it, even that's like people are fearful of doing that. And people are just more and more fearful of just deliberating ideas in their classroom.
Yeah.
Stand with it.
So,
Talk.
to
Right.
me, it was just important to kind of situate what conversations we're having right now and about what is something that can even be deliberated.
Right. Absolutely. Dane, should we go on to the next? Oh, Rob, go ahead. You haven't
Yeah,
said yet.
I'm just wondering, and maybe other people think differently, but I'm wondering if the rhetorical tradition has enough or lots of resources for thinking about the practice of inclusion, or if the resources of the rhetorical tradition are like more rich with examples of a kind of the kind of rhetorical practice you see in this quote, where like divisiveness is a powerful move for constituting public culture. So my concern right now is that the question for me is like, what are the rhetorical resources for enacting kind of relationality across difference in meaningful and constructive ways? Like, I don't look around and see an awful lot of that in the US. I don't see infrastructure for that. I'm not sure the rhetorical tradition has given us a whole lot of resources for that kind of work. And even if I think about my students, the first thing they think of rhetoric, when they think of rhetoric, they think of the kind of divisiveness, the kind of like persuasion through these other means of that you see Trump use in polarization, et cetera. So I think one limitation for our moment right now is we need to invent more resources for the kind of intellectual and rhetorical labor required for inclusive deliberation. We don't have the infrastructure for it. We don't have the resources for it. And Mark is probably going to might say there are examples, and there are examples, but they need rehabilitation, they need recirculation, they need reanimation, because they're not as present, at least for my students. They don't think those things first. Anyway.
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
That's what I mean. I've written 2 books on exactly what you talked about, and people don't read them.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what you talked about.
Yes, I agree.
The resource is there. The resources are there. And in a larger sense, I mean, there are resources in the rhetorical tradition that go all the way back to the pre-Socratics that allow us to address and engage these issues. They've just never been part of the dominant trajectories, which are the philosophical or the technical, right? The problems that we're facing are moral problems. That means they're adaptive problems. Technical solutions do not address adaptive problems. And our use of language is largely the technical use of rhetoric as argument and persuasion in law and education and politics, and it doesn't work because I mean, when we talk about democracy, what democracy are you talking about? Because this country has never been a democracy. It's never been a democracy. So when people are talking, I mean, when I saw people and social media, I've actually started looking at social media and just seeing this constant, we've lost our democracy's threatened. Everything that they're talking about is stuff that was done to Black people in this country and is being done right now with the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act for 500 years. So one, why would we call this a democracy and agree that it's a democracy unless we accept that in a democracy, you can have slavery and you can have injustice?
Right.
Because that's a democracy in the Western tradition.
Right.
From the Greeks until today.
Right.
So that I don't think African American rhetorical tradition is a great resource for understanding how to manage the contradictions that we are now having to deal with at a global level, because Black people have dealt with this from day one. So if you want resources, you'll find them there.
Right. Yeah, and I think just kind of 2 points to build, Mark, on what you're saying and what others have said. So one is the question of scale, right? So if we say our democracy is at stake or democracy is on the ballot, those are often pitched at the level of the nation. And obviously the nation is important. And when things happen in the center of governance like DC, they impact us, as all of us know, in various ways for our universities and colleges. But it's not just at the level of nation, right, in terms of scale that we can and should think about these questions. And so, what if we think about sort of democracy happening at different levels at different times so that the national government is moving in an anti-democratic direction at the same time that local communities may be embracing democracy in ways that they had taken for granted or committed in an environment of challenge to persevere, right? To continue to move forward. Both of these things can be true at the same time. And so, right, we don't have to say it's an all or nothing question. But then I think the second point that you bring up, Mark, and others as well, is that the politics of exclusion have been there from the very beginning. And so let's not idealize that either. Ancient Greece was a homogeneous culture because the vast majority of people who lived in these places were not permitted to participate. And we see this story told again and again and again, whether we talk about the public sphere in Europe and the American public sphere, that exclusion promotes a vibrant practice among a select group. But opening up ourselves to difference, creates new challenges and problems. So I think, we shouldn't idealize any of this, but we also don't have to treat it as an all or none proposition. I mean, it would be better if we had a national government that was committed to democracy in its institutional form, but that doesn't mean that we can't also look at other places in terms of questions of scale to look for democracy. Dane, you want to ask the next question?
Sure, thank you. Karen DeMasters wrote, I am a strong believer that limiting money in elections can turn around some of these problems. A constitutional amendment setting limits in this area seems to me the only answer. How do you feel we can accomplish that? And do you think that will make a difference? To which Karen Walker responded, I think it's unlikely in practical terms, but the root problem is Citizens United versus FEC. I'm not hopeful for cases in federal appellate courts that would lead the existing Supreme Court to overturn that ruling. And Karen DeMasters replied, I agree, it seems impossible. I would like to see us pressure our legislators to pass an amendment. The only way is to end the effect of Citizens United.
So, panelists, how about the role of money in all this?
All right, I'll say it. It's the root of all evil.
I disagree. Like I don't I don't share the view that an amendment will necessarily cause or catalyze the kind of change we want. Rob, your question before was about institutions, right? And like, I think that institutions are constitutive or co-constitutive with everyday practices. Like, yes, I'm a Deweyan. So if you change the laws, you don't necessarily create the conditions for the flourishing of democracy if the everyday practices of association are still authoritarian or toxic or problematic. The money will find other ways to co-opt the social democracy. So you need change in both. You need both a law or rules or amendments like that, and changes at the level of constructive modes of association across difference. At least that would be my contention. One is not sufficient because they constitute one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jenny?
I do. I think it's important to say, I mean, of course, like, sure, I'd like to see these reforms passed, but what we're seeing happening here, the kind of attacks, the authoritarianism, the rise, is not only happening in the United States. We are seeing this happen. The far right we're seeing everything that's happening now, like Orban has already done 6 months, we're 6 months behind what's happening in Hungary, for example. We're seeing things happen, not just across the far right in Europe, but this is a global rise of authoritarianism. And so it's not somehow unique to our specific messed up system, I don't think. That's not to say that that wouldn't solve a lot of issues we're having, but I do think it's important to recognize that this far right rise of authoritarianism, the attack on liberalism, Enlightenment ideals, all of these kinds of things, these ideas are happening in many different kinds of political contexts. I mean, governmental wise, institutional wise, and that in itself, I think, should cause us to ask broader questions beyond simply our own, national context, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Brooke?
this is a global phenomenon. And I think we are watching the beginning of the end of white world supremacy. Because people don't want to talk about it, but that's what got us where we are.
Mm-hmm.
500 years of white world supremacy and colonialism and slavery. And even slavery, I mean, if you read what the early colonists wrote about slavery, they equated slavery with having to pay taxes. That's what they equated slavery with. And I remember when I was a kid, nobody ever talked about freedom and justice and equality. The reason for the American Revolution was taxation without representation. That was the reason.
Mm-hmm.
And as John Lewis Lucchese and Celeste Condit have shown, the notion of equality that we think was somehow embraced by those men, it was completely outside of their consciousness. The notion of social equality,
Right.
civil rights, those are African American inventions. And I mean, read Condit and Lucchese because it's the best work on this. It's amazing. And when we think that those men believed in freedom and justice and equality, they rarely use the word equality. And that's empirical. That's an analysis of their rhetoric. So in that sense, rhetoric can help us understand the realities we're encountering today. I will say that again, and I'll stop after this. The solution to these problems really is empathy in the sense of implicature. How am I implicated? If you really want to figure out how to solve a problem, ask yourself first, how am I part of the problem? And that's the paradigm shift that has to happen. And quite frankly, it's one thing to say doing that, it's another thing to actually do it. And I guess the last thing I would say is this: what is the measure of your commitment to justice? Because it's easy to say you're committed to justice, it's easy to write stuff, but I can tell you in the 40 years that I've been in higher education, repeatedly, I have encountered acts of bullying and harassment and intolerance and racism and sexism. And in those instances where I was in a position of authority, I put an end to it.
Mm-hmm.
I can point you to court cases where somebody was subjected to an injustice and I stood up and I did something. So the mechanisms that we have, there's nothing wrong with them, but if we don't use them when we have the authority to do so, then we allow this to continue. And, you know, I mean, we all work in higher education, and I think we all know that there's a lot of bullies and there's a lot of cowards, and there are very few people of conscience and courage.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Brooke.
So on the topic of Citizens United, I'm far be it from me to say that money has not had a massive role in corrupting politics. That said, though, both Trump administrations took place in the post-Citizens United era. One of the biggest differences between those administrations was not money in politics, but the breakdown of institutions. I think the odds that we get a constitutional amendment in this current crisis taking money out of politics are very low. And the Roberts Court has made it quite clear they're much more interested in extremifying their decisions than moderating them. Given that, I think it is important to continue having the ongoing conversation about money, but it is far more important to focus on the things we can do to address the current democratic crisis than emphasizing the things it is unlikely in the short term we're going to be able to address, particularly policies that even if we were able to pass them, which is unlikely, the Roberts Court is quite likely to strike down. So I think looking at where are those specific local and mid-level institutions that broke down between the two administrations, and how can we design them with those breakdowns in mind to build them back up in a theoretical world in which he either isn't in office or doesn't have control of both parts of Congress, is more important for sustaining local mobilization and convincing people that something can continue to be done.
Right. Thanks, Brooke. Angel.
The question was a question about the economy and what was it? What function does the economy play in democracy? Is that
Economy, money, economy, yeah.
What I wrote down might not be as relevant anymore.
That's all right.
But so one of I wrote like three things. One of them is the role that cryptocurrencies play in the new order of nation states. I'm thinking about like the latest case that I can think of is this loan that the Trump administration just gave to Milei from Argentina, which I think is fascinating, right? That like that we in the United States would be investing money in Argentina to help them win an election, right? To help Milei win an election there. Anyway, the other thing that I made so many notes. So the next, I'll just go to the last one. The last one is I think right now the role that the economy is playing, particularly in the United States, in terms of democratic participation, has to do with making sure that there's a class of people who are economically happy and kind of chill and won't rock the boat, won't feel like they have to go protest, but also won't feel terribly poor. And I was reading this economic analysis that kind of put the number on it. I think that they said there's two sort of lines that they're looking at. One of them is like if you make $250,000 as a family unit, if you make that or more, you're more likely to live a pretty well life. If you make 175 or more, you're more likely to not go protest over politics because your life will feel just fine. So I think that I think that the economy tends to be one of those rhetorical forces in terms of like indicating whether we'll care about politics. In a way that I think rhetoric sometimes ignores. And Marxists obviously don't ignore that, right? Historical materialists don't ignore that. But sometimes when we get caught up on discourse, we tend to forget the power that the economy has on the electorate. Anyway.
So one thing to note, and then Annie and David, I think you also wanted to contribute. So what about money and education? And by this, I mean formal education, because it seems like something that has happened recently, which seems odd if we think that, people sort of respond to their economic interests primarily, is the working class shift. And this is also, you have to break this down by color, particularly talking about white working class folks, kind of shift to the anti-democratic politics, but also a shift, maybe not as pronounced, among college educated, college degreed white people, suburbanites who have moved away, not entirely, maybe not flipped, but away from that politics. So here's for example, in the state of Wisconsin, prior to Trump won, the last time that a Republican candidate had carried the state was Reagan in 1984. And the reason that's true is because there has traditionally been two electorates in Wisconsin, a presidential year electorate and a non-presidential year electorate. And Republicans did very well in off years because the most reliable voters those things tend to correlate with money and education, right? In terms of voting in off year and other kinds of things. But the situation in Wisconsin has flipped so that in presidential year elections, the electorate looks much more friendly to a conservative, well, I don't want to use that term, to a Republican candidate. And the off-year elections look more friendly to a Democratic candidate, precisely because Republicans have lost those college-educated, not all of them, but enough of those college-educated suburban voters to turn the tide. And so the map is it's just turned around. It went from election year, presidential election year politics being more favorable to Democrats and off year being favorable to Republicans to the opposite. So I wonder about that aspect of the role of education that we have seen in the last 10 years or so, some movement among the graduates of colleges and universities to resist these dynamics, even as working class folks, primarily white working class folks, have embraced this kind of strongman type figure and strongman type politics. I don't know if anybody wants to sort of go off on that or not. Yeah, David.
Donald Trump should be a focus of our efforts too, because he engaged in over 600 rallies between 2015 and 2024. And I attended one because I wanted to hear what he was saying. And he was deploying the kind of empathy that Mark and others are calling for his particular audience. And even though it was repugnant to me, I could see that he was appealing to people in small towns who, some of them had been left behind because of globalization. Some of them were angry because they were feeling that they were being replaced. And many of them, in the wake of NAFTA, had turned to right-wing media and Fox News in particular to receive the narratives of the day. And so I think it's imperative that we understand what the Trump supporter and Trump voters have found appealing to Trump. And Trump, in the rally that I attended, said, I love you, I hear you, I feel your pain. And so there was a kind of a negative expression of empathy there. And Rob, I want to also underscore the fact that there is, as we all know, I think, that a diploma divide, that people who have higher education background are much more likely to vote for progressive candidates than those who do not. So how are we complicit as educators in creating the divide that we are facing in this country? What can we do with our rhetorical theory to bridge that divide? And again, I think we need to go back to empathy and identification and money. I think money plays a role. We need to take into consideration all the constellation of factors that go into the rise of Trump and fascism in this country.
Right. Yeah. Annie?
Okay, so the conversation went in lots of different directions, so I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I love that last comment, and it just makes me, I have to invoke the C word, which is capitalism. And so I think one of the things that we have, whether it's the Brooke, I love your point about with the Supreme Court, just like forget about it right now. But really thinking about, or I think it was Angel's point about how we're going to try to float Argentina's government now to prove that even though the economy is totally tanking, no, it was okay. Like this guy totally has it when you're going to do that to the markets. And so I think we still, when I was kind of riffing and kind of joking about the actually existing democracy, obviously I'm riffing on this idea of communism. And so I do think the ways in which capitalism structures education, structures our identity politics, if we're not actually talking about the way class is a part of our political system, our educational system, the government wouldn't be going after education so hard if it wasn't so important to changing the political landscape of this country. And I mean, voucher programs, I mean, all the way up to, higher ed is where I'm focused, but you can see it all over the place. And so one of the things, I'm just going to return to my kind of opening remarks, which I think is kind of our task, because there's so many fires and obviously we can't attend to them all, but really thinking about rhetoric is the generative component. So if we're looking at practices, how can we intervene? And sometimes that's in the classroom, maybe in other ways, but also the analytical. And so the diagnostic of what is going on when Trump does speak in ways that people identify with, that moves them, that makes them feel like they are heard and not overlooked. But also to Mark's point about the forked tongue of democracy. Democracy has always made claims that have never actually existed, and yet we still hearken to them. We still pitch our lives against this idea. And so part of me is like, that's, I think our task now is one, to understand that our political system is based on a big lie. And yet, what do we do about that now?
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where I'll leave it. But I want to thank the other panelists because I've learned a ton today. Thanks.
So we only have a few minutes left. So real quick, I saw that Dana Cloud had asked in the comments about social movements. And I don't think we've spent a lot of time talking about that. And we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But like, if we did a lightning round, does anybody want to give your like sort of quick take, like 30 seconds or a minute on what role social movements can play in our current moment? David.
Quickly, go
And
to
Mark.
the rally tomorrow, and they will be in your town. There's 2,500 sites. The organizers have been rigorously focused on nonviolence, and it's supposed to be a rally of some joy, although I think that's hard to sustain right now. But tomorrow would be a step that we all could take in supporting our fellow citizens who are arguing for a more just society.
Yeah.
Okay, quick takes, Mark.
I would just say that the continuation of the moral foundations of the Black freedom movement are probably the only thing they're going to save this country.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? Quick take on social movements. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Dane to wrap us up.
Looking at other global contexts at how nonviolence resistance has undermined even extremely militarized authoritarian regimes and made room again for democracy is a really good way of maintaining hope that things can be made different, and even right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Brooke. Okay, Dane, why don't you close us out?
Okay, well, thanks very much, Rob. And I just want to say on behalf of the NCA that we appreciate Rob putting this together, all of the panelists doing a great job and being so willing to participate today, and everybody else who in the audience who asked questions and was just here to soak it in all in for an hour or two. So anyway, we will have two more public programs next year, probably one in March or April and one again in the fall. So stay tuned. And also, I will mention next Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, we have one of our video learning opportunities called Academic Freedom and a Commitment to Idea, Navigating the Current Cultural Climate. And it's sponsored by the NCA's Idea Council. There's a lot more information about it on the NCA website, and I hope you'll register for that and come to that next Friday morning. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody. This was a fantastic public program, and on behalf of NCA, we really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.